Welcome back, listeners, to another episode of The History Blokes. I'm Chris McComb.
I'm Conan Ovick.
And we're here to discuss curious facts, fantastic stories, and interesting and strange people from Australia's past. And we're coming to you from Ngunnawal country here in Canberra. We appreciate, I think now 6 listeners we're up to now.
Yes, and 2 downloads.
Indeed.
So, given that there's 2 of us, that makes sense.
That's right.
Now,
we only have one mother each, so it's fine. So, Conan, for our 11th episode, what are we going to be talking about today?
So, for First Nations listeners, we will be talking about people who have passed away, and in particular, David Unaipon. Now, Chris, I'm going to hold up to the microphone, as Philip Adams is so fond of saying on Late Night Live, a $50 note, which very few people use now because everyone's electronic. But as you can see, Chris, so I'm just rustling it to the microphone. We've got Edith Cowan on one side, who we've already talked about, and on the other side we have David Unaipon. I wanted to talk about him because he was quite an extraordinary man. He was an inventor, he was a great writer, an orator, preacher, and an activist. And he lived until his 90s, which is remarkable given that he was born in the late 19th century.
Wow.
And Aboriginal. Given that he lived so long, it gives us a sort of insight into what it was like for Aboriginal people in Australia over such a long period of time.
Over an incredible period of transition as well.
But as ever, Chris, before that, we're going
to do the quiz. Once again, caveat listeners, I don't do any research on these topics. I come in very fresh. I sympathise.
I think that's
completely.
Quite apparent, Chris. Question 1. You're a mad fan of Thomas Edison.
Indeed.
So, to whom was he a meanie? He was a meanie.
I would suspect he was a meanie to many folk, but let's face it, it was him versus sort of Tesla, I suppose, when it comes to the old AC versus DC.
What can you tell us about... So that was called the Battle of the Currents.
I think it wasn't. They made a movie, it's available on Netflix about. Edison was extremely good at the business side, commercialisation and so on.
And he was pushing DC, wasn't he?
He was absolutely pushing DC,
current.
direct current, that's correct. Alternating current, which is what Nikola Tesla developed, was pushing, of course has become universal. Clearly it is the most robust system. But Thomas Edison is often the one that we remember, outside of the Tesla car, of course, because he's synonymous with famous electrical devices and, the light bulb.
And I think he did some quite spectacular stunts to demonstrate that AC was a bad idea.
Fascinating period of history.
Yeah. Question 2. What is the name of the drawing of the nude dude who Da Vinci drew?
The Vitruvian Man.
Very good.
Indeed.
Yes. And do you know anything about it? Why was it called the Vitruvian Man?
I don't know why it was called the Vitruvian Man, but it was all about proportion of the human body. And the divine proportion, if I recall as well, was an element in that, a golden ratio.
I will accept that. That sounds all perfectly plausible. So the name comes from the writings of the Roman architect Vitruvius. Leonardo was a keen anatomist, so very into proportion how the human body relates to architecture and the workings of the universe.
Yep. He literally defined the Renaissance man, the intellectual that worked across many different fields.
I like to think of myself as a 21st century Renaissance man, sort of a cross between Da Vinci's mind and the Vitruvian man's body, if I may be so bold as to say that.
Well, that's how I perceive you. Oh, hang on, in opposite.
Yeah, fair point. Well, the Vitruvian man who's really let himself go. I think a latter-day Vitruvian man would be interesting to look at. It would be someone whose body mass index was considerably different to that of the Vitruvian man. Question 3. It can be argued that the tank was invented by an Australian. Do you have any idea who that was?
No.
Because, it's generally thought that the French and the British sort of more or less simultaneously, possibly the French first came up with the tank during the First World War. He had the extraordinary name of Lancelot de Mole.
Wow.
That's a fantastic name. So apparently de Mole came up with a design for the tank as early as 1912 and then presented it to the Australian Army. They weren't interested. Did so again in 1914, likewise, and 1916, likewise.
It reminds me of that Black Box episode. My goodness.
So Marie Curie discovered what 2 elements?
Okay, so that was thorium.
No.
Damn it. Radium. Can't think of the second one. Sorry.
Polonium.
Thank you. Yes, for sure.
She was the first woman to win 2 Nobel Prizes in different categories.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Finally, another woman inventor who invented the dishwasher.
I'm going to say either Miss Fisher or Miss Peichel.
One of your worst efforts, Chris.
Thank you.
No, her name is Josephine Cochran, and she was American. She invented it in 1886. It was
1886?
Yeah. Now, it was a hand-powered dishwasher, but quite reminiscent of the dishwashers we have now. It's just you do have to crank it. But, obviously they didn't have electric appliances, so it wouldn't have been, you just, replace the hand bits with a motor and you've got a contemporary dishwasher. Also, what's impressive about it is that she made a go of it from a business point of view. So obviously there's always that discrepancy between the cunning invention on the one part and the marketing and business side of things on the other. A lot of inventors don't have the ability to make both of those things happen.
And we're going to see a little touch of that in the intermission.
Okay, look forward to that. Okay, so Chris, let's get into. So we're just taking a break while Chris, with a gleeful look on his face, mucks around with it. He's very proud of his fireplace, and it is a handsome unit.
It's a wonderful ambience for a winter podcast.
It is, yes, and and you've got the poker there. You've got the little shovel. I assume you enjoy sort of pokering around in there.
So you can spend hours just prodding and poking your fireplace.
Okay, so Chris, we're talking about David Unaipon, as I said. He was born in 1872 at what was called the Point Macleay Mission. So it's about 100 kilometres southeast of Adelaide. And the Macleay Mission, so it's now called Rorcan, I think that's how you pronounce it. Obviously the original name for the place. He was one of 9 children, and indeed David Unaipon was, being brought up on this mission, remained devoutly Christian his entire life. Now, but the thing about Point Macleay is that yes, it was a mission, but it was set up by an organisation called the Aborigines Friends Association, the AFA. Which sort of sounds like it might have been
well-meaning,
based.
At least, yeah.
It was well-meaning. It was completely white, though.
The way you've kind of framed that are the sort of people that might actually be looking for opportunities for those people under their care or the groups they're involved with, versus maybe others, which is all about kind of oppressing, potentially.
Yeah. And education was a feature of life on that particular...
That's a step in the right direction.
Yes. I mean, obviously, it wouldn't have occurred to them that Aboriginal culture should be maintained. It was really about sort of integrating them into white society. But I think as much as possible within the context of the time, they were probably thinking, well, let's do it with the best interests of the Aboriginal people in mind.
Which I think is, that's a worthy ambition.
Yeah, certainly for the time it was, yeah. Before we go any further, we should say that David Unaipon seems to have been an extremely gifted man, and that was evident very early on when he was being taught at the local primary school, that he just had an enormous thirst for knowledge. He was soaking everything up. He was an extremely bright boy. But before we get more into his life, there were 3 kinds of white settlement for Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people around the country. In the 19th and 20th centuries, many First Australians were forced from country onto missions, reserves, or stations. Those were the 3. So it wasn't unusual for families to be separated and sent to different areas, sometimes across state borders, with no idea of where their loved ones ended up. Broadly speaking, missions were created by churches or religious individuals to house Aboriginal people. So I'm getting this from the IATSIS website, so thank you, IATSIS. So the idea was to convert them to Christianity and prepare them for menial jobs. Reserves were usually parcels of land set aside for Aboriginal people to live on, and were not managed by the government or its officials. People living on it on unmanaged reserves might receive rations and blankets from the state or territory government, but often remained responsible for their own housing. And then you had stations, or what were called managed reserves. So these were generally managed by officials appointed by the government, and these people had no experience necessarily, certainly no training. Schooling in the form of preparation for the workforce, and by workforce I mean menial work, servants or whatever. Rations and housing were provided, and station managers tightly controlled who could and could not live there. The managers usually had total control over Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lives, including legal guardianship of their children. So who you married, where you went, whether you were able to leave the mission, all of these.
It feels like a little fiefdom.
Yes.
Of in terms of the way that's been structured, which is, that's a recipe for disaster for the folk that live there.
Exactly.
Surely.
Yeah. So the opportunities for abuse in every conceivable way were rife.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that these protectionist policies, this term protection was sort of used to describe these broad policies. So mission reserves and stations were designed to sort of erase people's cultural identity. People were separated from their lands and families. They were not allowed to speak their languages and or continue their cultural practices or teach them to their kids. So David attended the mission school from the age of 7. And the mission school teacher, Walter Hutley, developed Unaipon's interest in popular science, introducing him to the idea of perpetual motion, which Unaipon remained fascinated with his entire life.
Really?
Yeah.
That's already new to me.
Yeah.
Straight up.
And while the mission was dedicated to raising Christian children, it also provided an opportunity for Unaipon to explore other interests. So the AFA established what it called a mutual improvement society and offered mission residents lessons in music and drawing and stuff like that.
Good on them.
They were good eggs.
That's right. I think they were trying.
Yes.
They were genuinely trying. And certainly you take that over a station, hands down, or one of those other missions where they're,
It's much more draconian and...
100%.
Unaipon's musical brilliance was quick to shine. He played the church organ for a number of years and became a master of Handel's The Messiah and other complex refrains. And the mission also had books and journals, and Unaipon spent hours poring over the pages of sort of scientific works. Now, when he was 12 or 13, with his parents' permission, he was taken to the home of a bloke called C.B. Young, who was patron of the AFA, and was introduced to classical literature, Greek and Latin. So I think this was in Adelaide itself. So in this sort of informal ways, education continued to flourish. But he was effectively a servant to C.B. Young, and he remained there for about 5 years. So, he came. So at about age 20, he came back to the mission and learnt bootmaking. And he took a job as a storeman and assisted at the Point Macleay stores as a bookkeeper. But obviously he was getting vexed by his limited circumstances. But around this time, in 1902, he married a Tangani woman from Coorong called Catherine Carter, who was a servant. Sadly, their marriage wasn't particularly successful, so they had a son, but a lot of the time he was absent. She spent a lot of time on the road. Yeah, so from this point onwards, he starts to go on the road a bit. But remember that most Aboriginal people at the time were under the control of someone or other, someone white. And it really wasn't possible to move around. I mean, it's very hard to this is like a police state for a section of the community where the idea of having to think about getting permission to do it and probably having that permission denied.
Yeah, everything would have been a massive effort, a big undertaking to do any of this sort of thing. And he did this on his own volition, though.
I imagine, though, that he was probably encouraged to, because he maintained a connection with the AFA, so their relationship seemed to fluctuate. I imagine he was frustrated by his circumstances, and he was a young man that led to friction in terms of what he wanted to do, what he knew he was capable of doing, and what the AFA felt he was realistically going to be able to do in a white society. But nonetheless, he believed in the AFA, the Aboriginal Friends Association, and the work they were doing, and was happy to promote their work around the country. So that was part of what he was doing as he moved around Southeast Australia over the next few decades. But when it comes to freedom of movement, I just want to touch on that. So when the Australian Constitution took effect on 1st of January 1901, each individual state acquired the primary lawmaking power over Aboriginal people.
I see. I wonder what that would have resulted in. Probably, I'm guessing, severe restrictions on specific rights and movement and so on in one state, maybe less so in other states, depending on the priorities or whatever the views of the politicians.
And they didn't lose that power until the referendum in 1967. So one of the two things that referendum changed was that the Commonwealth acquired that power to make decisions for Aboriginal people across the country.
Okay, no, I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Do you know the other thing that the 1967 referendum changed? A lot of people think it was the vote, but in fact Aboriginal people had got the vote shortly before that.
If I recall, it was enabling Aboriginal people to be counted on the census.
So that's right, Chris. Yes, they're finally counted as human. So as I said, there was this period of protectionism began in the late 1890s and would continue into the 1950s, and was characterised chiefly by segregation. In 1937, the Commonwealth government held a conference on Aboriginal affairs, and this is a kind of chilling phrase, to discuss what they call the Aboriginal problem.
I knew you were going to say that. Yeah. I knew you were going to say that.
Yeah. So obviously this was before the Holocaust. I'd never heard that anyone used that term until I was researching this. So it was during this that they agreed that Aboriginal people who are not quote unquote, who are not of full blood, be assimilated into the community. Because the perception was that, and again I use this term advisedly, full blood Aboriginal people as they saw it at the time were considered to be dying out. Because they were considered to be intrinsically inferior, even though they had lived in this place for 60,000 years, one of the harshest environments in the world, and were far older civilization than pretty much any other civilization, including obviously European.
I mean, it fits the pseudoscience and all that sort of thing that was circulating at the time around.
Phonology.
Measuring your skull shape to determine what type of person you are.
They had a sort of racial scale.
Racial scale,
whites at the top. And
that eugenics kind of movement that was occurring at that time. And then, it manifested itself, obviously, in the worst, all possible ways through the Second World War, clearly.
Yeah. The policy of assimilation governed the lives of Aboriginal people from the 30s to the 60s. Under these policies, Aboriginal people were expected to live like white people, adopting European cultural practices and language. And of course, it was during this period too that we saw the policies of the stolen generations. So the rate of forced removal of Indigenous children from their families increased because the perception was that full-blood Aboriginal people, and that's a term that was used at the time, it's certainly not acceptable now, they would die out, but what you could do is take the children of, remember, it wasn't the children of so-called full-blood Aboriginal people that were taken, it was only those where white parentage was involved, because it was believed that you could take the children, train them up as domestics, and then you could breed out the Aboriginal blood over a few generations. This is why it's been described as a form of genocide, because you are deliberately seeking to eradicate the race. So there was a way you could get out of being treated as contemptibly as this. You could, in effect, quote unquote, cease to be Aboriginal and get documents demonstrating that. So it was called exemption. Any person holding a certificate of exemption had to live under certain rules. You had to live like a white person, whatever that means. You had to display exemplary behaviour, again, whatever that means. Ceasing all contact with non-exempt Aborigines, other than immediate family, and you had to carry your certificate with you at all times.
So basically, it's kind of voluntary assimilation, effectively.
Okay. Yeah. So, but it meant that you had a few more freedoms. You could move around a bit more. You had control over how you spent your money. These kinds of things. So you weren't, infantilized. In effect. And it enabled you to drink alcohol and the right to own land, that kind of thing.
It'd be interesting to know how those people were received in the broader society at the time as well.
No, not fantastically well.
I suspect so.
I actually don't know to what extent that was taken up. It would be interesting to know. Anyway, look, we've diverted, we've tangented, if that's a word, which it isn't. Let's get back to Unaipon. In 1909, because as I said, he was an inventor. Again, Chris, I'm going to hold up the $50 bill and we can see...
Mind doing that Russell thing again?
Anyone at home, if they have a $50 note, they can have a look at it. And just to the right of Unaipon's portrait is the schematic of a device. Any idea what that is, Chris?
Looks like a shearer.
You're correct.
Am I right? Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was a mechanized sheep shearing handpiece, which he patented. But what I didn't realise, I don't know if this is still true, but it's relatively affordable to sort of get a provisional patent on something, but to cement that patent, if you like, in your name, you have to then spend more, which he didn't have. So he patented, depending on the source, I've heard 19 devices over the course of his life. He took out several patents, but he wasn't able to afford to take out full patents on any of them, so they lapsed and other people took his ideas in some cases. Now, when it comes to the handpiece was quite ingenious. It was cunning in that it turned rotary motion into lateral motion. I don't believe he was the first person to come up with a mechanized handpiece, but they weren't in widespread use. But in the decades following his patent, handpieces certainly were used prolifically, and it's likely that his design had some influence on that. But it's a little bit hard to verify.
Australia was, to some extent, riding on the sheep's back at the time, of course, as well. So it would have been quite an incredible game changer for the economy, really. I mean, how many sheep can you shear using hand shears versus mechanized shears? I mean, it must have doubled, tripled.
The
amount of
huge
sheep you could shear. Incredible
on productivity. Absolutely. Oh, he was also into experiments on polarized light, and he forecast the invention of the helicopter. In 1914, he wrote, "An aeroplane can be manufactured that will rise straight into the air from the ground by application of the boomerang principle. The boomerang is shaped to rise in the air according to the velocity with which it is propelled, and so can an aeroplane. The class of flying machine can also be carried on board ships, the immense advantages of which are obvious." So he was coming up with a modern design for a helicopter 15 years before it was actually properly done, So I'm not saying he came up with fully developed design for
the concept he was
the broad concept.
And it gave you a bit of a sense for the varied nature of his interest in this space, the physics piece in this example, the mechanics piece in terms of the shearer, among other things, and of course, the light and other things.
Yeah, and recognising in his own culture the inventive genius too. And in fact, before I forget, SBS has a great series called The First Inventors, about great inventions Aboriginal people have come up with, like fish traps and obviously the boomerang and various other things that a lot of people don't know about. So jump on that if you haven't already. Yes, and he said at one point, "I was always interested in inventing, as are most Aboriginals." I remember this great documentary series years ago about young Aboriginal blokes out in some remote area, and they'd had access to cars, but these cars were just dilapidated.
Oh, I know. The bush mechanics.
The bush mechanics.
They were amazing.
Yeah.
It's just quite
just
extraordinary.
Incredible ingenuity just to get these ancient, dilapidated cars functional.
Yeah, it's
really cool.
These guys are amazing.
Yeah.
Really amazing.
Yeah, so, I mean, quite, if you're living in Australia at any time over the last 60,000 years, I think if you're not ingenious, you're not surviving. I think I would have thrived personally. As I said, between 1909 and 1944, Unaipon made patent applications for several things, including a centrifugal motor, a multi-radial wheel, and a mechanical propulsion device. And so that was one aspect of his activities. The other thing he was into was activism. Before we get to the activism, Chris...
Is it time for intermission, Conan?
It is. On the subject of inventions, Chris,
let's go to a very different place.
Yes.
I'm going to be talking about something so iconic in the Australian, psyche, and that is the Hills Hoist. The Hills Hoist. I'm just going to call it the Hoist clothesline, and I'll explain why in a moment. Right. Because we actually don't know who invented the rotary hoist.
Right.
It's presumed that it's Australian, but to be quite honest with you, it goes back a very, very long time. I mean, people have been experimenting with it all over the world, really, since as far back as the 1850s, and trying to find a solution to an efficient clothes-drying system. But I think why Australia became very synonymous with the Hills Hoist is, well, a couple of things. One, we have great conditions for drying clothes outside on a line.
Yeah.
Secondly, the nature of our housing. We historically standalone houses on a block, quarter of an acre block, or whatever the case is. So we have a yard. And of course, there's this iconic image of a lone standing Hills Hoist surrounded by a devastated Darwin following Cyclone Tracy, which really kind of helped to embed the stoic, robust nature of the Hills Hoist. In history, people tended to peg them from house to house, your clothes, or hang them over bushes, and do all sorts of other things.
Sorry, that reminds me, I did see a documentary a while ago about the invention of this, and you'd hang clothes out, and you basically had a post, and you had a line, and the line might be attached to your house, and then you just jam the post in, like it wasn't a permanent fixture. You would erect it each time or something, and it was always falling over, and the clothes were getting dirty, and you had to wash them again. And part of the reason why nothing was really invented to improve on this was because, well, it's women's problem.
That doesn't surprise me at all, and it's funny. We'd almost got through 5 minutes without you talking about men's oppression of women, or white men's oppression of something. But we've managed to go there again as it relates to the washing. So thank you, I appreciate that. But I have no doubt that's true. So obviously, there used to be many clumsy ways in which we dried our clothes, and some of the very early attempts at having this clothesline. They had these very kind of heavy rack and pinion systems that, you could almost lose fingers in. It was just, really, really clumsy, really, really ugly and very, very industrial. But it was a very clever Australian. There was a blacksmith from Geelong called Gilbert Toyne. He was the hoist pioneer.
Right.
Okay, he's the guy that really kind of kicked things off here in Australia. And he, along with a friend called Lambert Downey, launched the Aeroplane Clothes Hoist Company at the Melbourne's 1911 Agricultural Show. And why was it called the Aeroplane Clothes Hoist Company Conan?
Oh, yes. Was it connected to aeroplane jelly, or indeed?
I'd like to say so, but you know why? Because it sounded cool.
Oh, right.
It's in the same way that products these days want to connect their product with the space program.
Oh, sure.
Some of their early designs were very clumsy, various ratcheting mechanisms, various counterweights. The whole thing was just an ugly mess. But that said, he managed to sell his hoists. What they did prove to be relatively popular. And he promoted them both as a labour-saving device, but what was quite interesting, it was also a device to avoid you catching diseases when you walk through wet grass. This is how it was promoted. Because if you had your hoist down this nice little paved concrete area, so you can stand in one spot, and you can swing the clothesline around, you hang your clothes up, you can hoist it up.
Yeah.
And of course, you don't have to step off the concrete.
No, you don't. Yeah, because
disease.
I'm always catching diseases from my lawn.
100%.
That's why I never set foot on it.
That's right.
The reason I don't go onto the lawn is now because we have 2 dogs and the lawn is unusable.
I would suggest barely a lawn at all anymore.
Yeah. It looks like the Somme, Chris. It looks like the Somme. Holes everywhere, excrement. The only way in which it differs from the Somme is the amount of clothing. The dogs will drag clothing from inside the house, chew it up all over the garden, and leave the remnants there amongst the excreta and the various trenches and holes they've dug.
Anyway, so his company only lasted a few years, and the reason was World War I came along, and Toyne basically headed off to fight. And this guy, if he didn't have bad luck, he wouldn't have had any luck at all. He was gassed, of course, in Europe, only to return to Australia to find his wife had left him with the company manager. So he kept going. That's the sort of guy he was. He kept at it, and he kept finessing his raising mechanism because it was pretty ugly still. And in 1926, he pretty much came up with the design that we still use today for that rotary hoist. So there's kind of this unit that sits halfway up the stem with a handle, and you just wind it up. No fingers are lost, of course. And by the 1940s, they were manufacturing this stuff, at a reasonable pace. Some 200 were being made every week. But he was he was like the Tesla of his time, where he was obviously a very good inventor, but he wasn't a very good businessman. He wasn't very good at promoting himself, promoting his design. And he ultimately, because he was struggling financially, had to sell the rights to another a family company in Melbourne. And he headed off to Sydney to reinvigorate his business and start selling to the New South Wales market. And he produced a range of different types of hoists, big hoists, small hoists, experimented with the hydraulic hoist and all sorts of stuff. But then the Great Depression came along, and that really started to impact on sales. So he's really, really struggling throughout that period. He moved back to Melbourne, and he traded under different names to avoid clashing with the Toyne rotary hoists that he sold that name to this other company, McCurdy's family in Melbourne. And so he came up with an exciting new name so as he could compete with them. It's called the Quick Drying Revolving Clothesline Company. So clearly he was more of an engineer than a salesman. And in 1941, his patent for the hoisting mechanism lapsed, which enabled his competitors and others to pick that up and run with it. And now this brings us to Hill.
Yeah.
The Edison of this story. So Lance Hill was from Adelaide, returned from World War II, and he also wanted to create a more space-conscious clothesline. And he wanted to incorporate, of course, Toyne's hoist into his own product. The design was all there, but he was just really, really good at promotion. And he also developed a whole range of other useful kind of laundry-related items. And he came in at the right moment, of course, because post-World War II, urbanisation was really kicking off. People were moving in for the cities. We had massive migration into Australia and so on. And everyone was looking for an efficient way to dry your clothes. Anyway, he continued to grow his business over many years. And really, by the mid-90s, he'd sold his 5 millionth hoist So, and it's a real Australian success story. But Gilbert Toyne, he died in 1983. He stopped making hoists around the time of Cyclone Tracy. So it's very, very sad. But that said, the impact of Toyne should not be forgotten.
Did he die a broken man?
I don't know if he died a broken man, but certainly he did not die a rich man.
No.
As Hill clearly did.
Yeah.
I might just touch on, it's perhaps a less exciting invention, but a really important invention. And strangely enough, this has, we'll call an indirect link to the Hills hoist. And that's cask wine.
I was hoping you would be touching on the Goon of Fortune.
We're going there. I'm going to tie these together.
Because it's one of your favourite hobbies, isn't it?
It is.
So, Chris, perhaps we should just explain for our overseas listener what a goon is. And we should also clarify that we have checked and it is not a racist slur. It's from flagon, as in flagoon.
So the cask wine, or the bag in the box, I suppose, was actually invented in Renmark by Tom Angove of Angove's Wine, of course. And they sold this wine in cartons, about 4.5 litres. And the reason why he came up with this concept was because, you'd open a bottle of wine, you've got to finish it.
Yeah.
The wine goes off if you leave it open and so on. So, because of efficiency reasons, it makes so much sense. You've got this kind of tap. It doesn't allow air into it. You continue to use it when you want. And of course, his inspiration being, of course, that as the volume decreases, the bag decreases, doesn't let any air in. It was patented in 1965, so it's been around for a very long time, and it really became the very first company to sell wine in a box. Interestingly, how snobbish Penfolds is, of course. Penfolds, the wine of choice. I do love Penfolds, by the way. Anyone who drinks Penfolds, delicious wine. But they followed...
They're not going to send you any wine.
Well,
they're going to send you some Grange.
No one from... Please send me some Grange for this podcast. I love you. Penfolds, of course, followed fairly soon. They had a bag, but not in a box, of course. You don't want to be like Angove's.
Yeah.
Bag in a tin. And it was called the table cask. Oh. Fundamentally, it allowed us just to have a couple of glasses without having to get completely sloshed by drinking the rest of the wine, which is a big mistake if you buy it in the 2.5 litre flagon.
And it's magnificent for the Goon of Fortune, which, as one of Canberra's leading proponents, Chris, you should explain what...
The Goon of Fortune. Okay, indeed. And I'm going... This is a shout out to the inventors of the Goon of Fortune, which are students everywhere since about 1965, when the Hills hoist was in its peak, of course, as was cask wine. So, this cask wine does tend to be reasonably priced for a whole range of reasons, which makes it absolutely ideal for students to purchase. And so what the Goon of Fortune is, you peg a single bladder... or goon,
yes,
if you like, the bag, to the Hills hoist. You have a bunch of your friends stand around, and then you spin the clothesline, and wherever it stops, you need to take a drink.
Yeah.
That's it. It's as simple as that.
Until the inevitable.
Sheer student genius. Good on
and
you.
It's actually, Sunday night at our place is Goon of Fortune, so helps the kids sleep. It's fantastic. And it's very cheap entertainment.
In fact, we should do a podcast while we're gooning.
Oh, that'd be great. I've been quietly gooning throughout. So back to Unaipon, Chris. So, as I say, he was involved in activism, but it's interesting to look at his particular approach. So he was completely convinced that Aboriginal people and white people were fundamentally equal, intrinsically the same, which was a view that was at odds with that of many white people. So he believed that Aboriginal people should be given the chance to become part of the modern world, but on their own terms rather than through the assimilation policies. And it speaks in some ways to his upbringing by sympathetic white people, as well as a certain pragmatism. So this is a quote from him. "The coming of the white man was in itself a blessing. We were isolated from the world's culture. It is true that my people could not adapt themselves to civilization, but that is because it came too suddenly for us." So he believes that rather than through the forced assimilation process, there should be this sort of less paternalistic, gradual process by which Aboriginal people can become part of so-called civilization. And he would have seen white civilization as being something that Aboriginal people should be aspiring to.
But the point is, you got to treat them as sovereign in order to achieve any of that. I can kind of see why he thought that.
But yes, but from a modern perspective, I guess.
From a modern.
A lot of Aboriginal people now would not want to lose their culture as part of the process of becoming it.
Exactly.
But he was
doing it on their own terms.
Yes,
that's the point, isn't it?
Yeah. So and it did put him at odds with certain other Aboriginal activists, particularly those who were organising the 1938 sesquicentenary protest, which we talked about in our in our Australia Day, Invasion Day episode. So his fame, urbanity, fastidious manner of speech and Aboriginal identity confounded stereotypes. And he even said at one point, and remember that he was Christian, he said, look at me and you will see what the Bible can do. So I guess that's part of what sort of makes him interesting. He's sort of halfway between the point of view of European colonizers at the time and how we now see things.
He's just a really complex character, interesting character, because he does straddle that divide.
Yeah.
I think
on his travels, he preached Christianity, but he lectured on the ideas of Aboriginal legends and customs, which he was very interested in. He was very interested in preserving them. Spoke of the need for sympathetic cooperation between whites and blacks, for equal rights for black people. So he did this for 50 years, which is a long time just to be moving around. Hence his marriage suffered. Tried to speak as much as possible about his people's future as he saw it. He demonstrated his inventions, but he could never really get the financial support to translate these into commercial.
The patent issue you mentioned before was one of those barriers, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. He gave evidence at a Royal Commission into Aboriginal issues. By the 1920s, he was the most well-known Aboriginal person in Australia. Because of his great oratorical skills, he was a great public speaker. He was in demand all throughout Melbourne, Sydney, Adelaide. But that doesn't mean he wasn't without passion and anger for what was going on. This is what he wrote in 1934. My fellow Australians with white skins, I belong to a race in whose welfare you have lately been taking an unusually acute interest. I do not question the genuineness of your motives. Your sincerity is undoubted. But when I read your newspapers and the opinions of your politicians, missionaries and scientists, I am saddened and astonished at your ignorance of our problems. It is not us, it seems, who are most in need of enlightenment. You appear to know no more about us than if we were Tierra del Fuegans.
Wow, that is brilliant. And how eloquent is that?
Yeah.
That's just punching home, isn't it? It just shows, what a thinker he was, and willing to put his views out there.
So he, as I said, he was very much into gathering the legends and myths of Aboriginal people. And he wrote a manuscript called Legendary Tales of the Australian Aborigines. He was the first Aboriginal person to be published in Australia. But as is not surprising, it was published in 1930 under the name of William Ramsay Smith, who commissioned them, but he wouldn't allow Unaipon to use his byline. He insisted on using his own, which was unfortunate and typical. But Unaipon published other books through the AFA, including a book called Hungada in 1927, Native Legends in 1929, and these were
books of stories and people and
stories
culture.
And myths.
Yeah, okay.
So other Aboriginal writers wouldn't really be getting published for another 30 years or so. He also published poetry in the 1930s, more legends in the 50s and 60s. According to Iatsis, his stories are varied and rich with detail, navigating the routine and the ritual. Chronicles about everyday activities such as hunting and sport are interspersed with stories about marriage customs and creation. He also wrote two memoirs, My Life Story and Leaves of Memory, which were published in 51 and 53.
So in many ways, he could have been one of the first people to document these in a book, these stories.
It's possible white anthropologists had done so earlier.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
But in terms of coming from an Aboriginal person,
exactly, which is a critical perspective.
He continued to travel on foot in Adelaide and country centres, where he was often refused accommodation because of his race, and he was still preaching at the age of 87. In his 90s, he worked on his inventions back at Point Macleay at Raupen, convinced that he was close to discovering the secret of perpetual motion. Yeah, and he died in 1967.
Died in 1967?
In his mid-90s. Yes, and since then, in 1988, the National David Unaipon Award for Aboriginal Writers was instituted. And in 1995, he was immortalised on our $50 note, and of course he's still there. So, Chris, that brings us to the end of Unaipon. Key learnings for you?
Indeed. Look, I actually think it was... I learned obviously a huge amount about someone who I recognised but didn't really know. Someone who lived for so long and saw so much change from the late 1800s through to the 1960s, kind of played a role in those changes in many ways, or at least an intellectual role in those changes. But then this guy's a polymath. He has so many other aspects to him, the music, the inventions and so on. I just think that's That's really quite extraordinary. Yeah, and what I think is also very interesting, he tried really hard, probably due to his upbringing, to bridge European or white society, if you like, with Aboriginal society. Whilst his ideas may be controversial from a modern perspective, he intellectualised it the best he could. So I think, good on him. What a remarkable person.
Yes, indeed. So next time we'll be talking about Harold Florey, the Australian who was at the heart of the development of penicillin during the Second World War.
Yep.
So until then, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.